Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, we have with us Dr. Danny Conn. He works for D6 Family Ministries, but you may not know, in the past, he served as a pastor down in the state of Florida. And you probably know a bit about David Potete. He is a church planter. He planted a church in Chicago and has been there. David, is it how many decades? 30 years you've been?
Yeah, 33.
33 years in Chicago, Illinois. And so thank you both for taking the time to join us today. Our listeners may think, okay, why do we have a D6 Family Ministries man that was, when he was pastoring in Florida, he's going to talk about that, and a pastor up in Chicago. Why do we have them on together? And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to both of you today is because you did what so many of us churches need to do. You made the handoff when somebody moved from Florida to Chicago, Illinois. I think a lot of our listeners are aware of the Great Dechurching, and the research tells us that 15.5% of the United States population has stopped attending church in the last 25 years. That's 40 million people. And our listeners have perhaps heard from Davis and Graham. We did a little podcast with them on the Great Dechurching, and they thought that one of the reasons people left was because they left the faith. But they learned, and they told us in that podcast, the overall number one reason people stopped attending church was simply they moved. And so you all made sure that did not happen with a couple, and their names are Andy and Robin. And so they ended up, Danny, let's start with you. They ended up making the handoff from the church that you pastored to the one that David pastored. So tell us a bit about how they ended up in Chicago and how they ended up at another Free Baptist church after leaving the church you pastored.
Well, Robin and Andy, they were, as teens, grew up in the church there in Pensacola, and they had both gone off to school to study architecture. They came back with their degree, but yet had to go somewhere to get an internship before they could get their license. And so they told me that there were three places they were looking at. Somewhere in Texas, someplace in Chicago, and then I think the third one was in Boston or somewhere like that. And I said, well, we don't have a church there, so you got to take that one off the list. I kind of jokingly told them. And to my surprise, they immediately said, okay, then it's off the list. And so I said, well, where do you want to go first? And they said, Chicago. I said, okay, I know a guy there. And so I called David Potete and told him, got a young couple, they're looking to move to Chicago. To go to architecture, to get a job in architecture. And he met them at the airport and took them home. I mean, I don't even think they rented a car.
So, David, this guy calls you out of the blue, Florida. Danny tells you these people are coming to town. You've never met them before. What in the world happened? How is it you end up at the airport to meet them, buddy?
Well, if I could just give a little history first. And first of all, Danny is the one that really accomplished this because he did what so others have not. So when we were starting the church, and to this day, I still get maybe a time or two a year, I'll get a call. But especially when we were starting the church and I was still raising funds and was, more active in visiting our churches around the country, I had a file of well over 100 emails, letters, or phone calls where I'd taken notes of people from around the country saying, oh, hey, my brother moved up to Chicago, and I wonder if you would go visit him, see if he'd be part of your church. And all of those came 6 months to a year or longer after they had moved. And nobody moves to our neighborhood from the South intentionally. If they do, I haven't found them yet. There are very few people that live in this neighborhood that have moved from the South. There are certain areas of Chicago where that has happened, and there's larger concentrations of people with Southern roots. But they never moved into this neighborhood intentionally. So they would have either already found a church, and then, even though I'm very committed to our denomination, I would struggle with, okay, do I try to twist their arm and play on that? Or do I say, okay, this is a kingdom thing, serve God, make a difference? But the majority of them, quite honestly, did what was in the Great Dechurching, is they just quit attending anywhere. But the problem is they would be so far from us that they wouldn't consider. I had a couple visit services sort of out of an obligation. And of all of those contacts over all of those years, we only had one, if I remember correctly. And I should have run this by my wife because her memory is way better than mine. But anyway, if I remember correctly, only one family of all those contacts that came after they moved, only one of them attended for any length of time, and they ended up not lasting very long. Again, because of the distance thing. So when Danny contacted me, this was like a breath of fresh air. This was like, this has never happened before. And our church was just all over it. So they contacted me, and when I talked with Andy, I said, look, when you come up to look for work, you need to stay at our house. We'll give you a key. You can borrow a car, whatever you need, we'll help you. And should you find work and end up moving here, we'll help you transition in. You can come stay with us while you look at an apartment. We just threw out the biggest welcome mat possible. So they took us up on that and stayed with us, and we just really clicked. And then when they ended up moving, they were definitely going to check out our church, but when they ended up moving, and I did not remember this, but in talking with Andy this last week, and Robin, when they moved, we had 16 people on our moving team that met them, and they were blown away by that.
Yes,
They
they
were
were.
young. I'm sorry?
I said, yeah, they impressed that they thought, there was so many people there that helped them move in, that they'd already found a home.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that was a big part of that. And we had, they were a young couple. They didn't have a whole lot of stuff. And we actually have a moving team in our church. It's an informal thing, but anytime someone's moving, and Chicagoans move a lot, especially the renters, because they're always looking for a better landlord or a better rent. And we have a moving team. We've had as many as, I think, 23 show up for a move. We call it a moving job. And it's an informal thing. So anyway, a few years after that, Andy actually designed a T-shirt for the Northwest moving team. And we still wear those to this day. When they're about to wear out, we need to make more of them. But anyway, Andy and Robin, they started attending, and they just dug in. I mean, they connected. Oh my goodness, I can't put into words the blessing that they were to us all of the years that they were here. So if your listeners can just get this, what I would recommend is, when you first hear of somebody possibly moving, you need to start talking to them about where they're moving, making sure that God is in this, making sure that He's leading them, and challenging them, discipling them into making sure that they're going to serve, that they're not going to back off and let this limit their involvement in church, but that they see this as a new opportunity, and even send them, maybe even commission them in a service, saying this family's moving and we want to give them our blessing and we want to pray God's blessing. Just whatever you can do to challenge them to get involved in another local church and serve and make a difference.
That's great. So, and a big part of this is definitely Andy and Robin. Number one, they came to you early, David, and they came to you early too, Danny, and
before the move. That's key. That's key.
Yeah.
I told them that you need to find a church before you find a house.
That was good.
I remember them telling me that. Yes.
Yes, and so that kind of helped make the difference. So obviously they're solid believers trying to follow the Lord. They were young back then. And so they talked to you and they realized they want to be part of a good church. And so they listened to your guidance, Danny, and then you had the wherewithal to go ahead and get with Brother David, and everything went really good with that. And you made the handoff. It's interesting. Davis and Graham talk about as a church, and this gets to what you were saying, David, about praying for them, as kind of almost commissioning them. That a pastor and a church should consider the people their responsibility until they find another church wherever they move to. And I think that goes along with the idea of what you're saying, kind of commissioning them, and they got tied in pretty quick, didn't they?
Very quickly. It was virtually seamless. It really was.
So the first thing I pick up is being intentional about where you live. And I hear that, Danny, even though you were joking about Boston, if or wherever that was in the Northeast, they were thinking that way.
Yeah.
They said, well, we know a Free Will Baptist Church is there, so they were intentional about it.
Mhm.
And then you didn't just give them an address. You talked to David, and David was intentional about getting them placed. He meets them at the airport, opens his home to them, and uses the moving team. And then, boy, I mean, I'm sure they were able to be involved for all those years they were there in Chicago. What a great story.
Yeah, and they grew like weeds, which shows there was some good discipling going on before they moved here. So Danny,
That's good.
hats off
Good
to you and
job.
your church.
Yeah, good
They
job.
were
And
very
just
dedicated, and they were eager to learn, and they would surprise us. They would spend a lot of times Friday evenings at our house, just the pastor and his wife. And y'all are a young couple. Aren't you out with your friends? They would come to our house and just uh, eat with us and visit with us, and it was encouraging for us as well. So we enjoyed just being around them. But I could not imagine just letting them go off away without finding somebody to take care of them, watch out for them, and continue what they were wanting to. They were eager to learn.
yeah. So you were determined to do that handoff there. Is
Mhm.
Now, David, I know you've talked to them recently, and they've given you some feedback about the whole process. What kinds of suggestions did Andy and Robin have?
Well, it was, I'll sort of summarize his comments in a minute, but I do want to mention, we have had to transition them. They actually, back in 2008, when the housing crisis hit, and that hit Chicago really hard. And in 2012, um, things were still recovering here. It was still a mess, and they actually were having difficulties here. So he took a position in another state, and they're deeply involved in a church there. But this is interesting that over the years, they have taken vacation time to come to Chicago to work with us during our VBS week. And I don't know if that's going to happen this year or not, but every couple of years they do that. And one year, Andy was our tech team leader. He's an architect by training, but he's smart. He just figures out whatever needs to be figured out. And so they had left and moved, and then they were up in 2019, I think. I forget the exact year. And we had just bought a new computer, and he spent one day he was here 13 hours, I think. And a couple of days he was here the bulk of the day. And he streamlined our whole sound booth, got rid of a bunch of outdated equipment. Guy's just such a blessing to us still. I call him constantly for advice on our building because he's an architect, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just want to put a plug in for that. So Andy and I, yeah, we talked over the years. We email back and forth and stay in touch. So Andy sent me an email a day or two ago, and I had asked his opinion or his thoughts on this. And he said, I'll say that looking back on the transition to Chicago, it was a great illustration of how God's design for Christian community is multifaceted, like the gospel. But sometimes we reduce it in our minds to a series of set arenas, you know, just certain areas of ministry, like one-on-one ministry or the local church, or we think of global missions. But he says, in reality, God's sovereignty and omnipresence calls us to a wider perspective that cares for the individual while also acknowledging his ultimate power and provision. I think of Acts 6, when they cared for fellow Grecian Jews in Jerusalem who were away from home, but with their new family.
That's good.
Newlyweds and young believers embarking on our first big step of faith. You and Danny helped reinforce that we were part of something bigger and that our family and our support community was not geographically limited. When we showed up in Chicago and 16 people from the Northwest moving team helped us unload the truck, it was even more clear this is where God had called us, and it was time for us to plug in and get to work. And then he adds jokingly, and Andy and Robin will appreciate this, after we stopped at Babo's. So if for anyone that's visited Chicago all these years, one of the first places we like to take them is my favorite hot dog joint. It's called Babo's. And there's a lot of fond memories at Babo's.
There's a picture of it in that office somewhere too, isn't
Yes,
there?
I do, right over there.
So there you go. And so they got to that on the early end, were able to learn about Babos and be a part of that. What a great story. And what he's spot on, isn't he? We're part of something bigger.
Yes.
And that's what you guys help convey. And they and their willingness to serve and they got it too, like you were saying, Danny. They were mature and are mature in the faith.
Well,
Wow.
and they definitely wanted to be involved somewhere. I mean, they were involved in our church in VBS. They were very creative, both of them, and so they were really making a big difference in our VBS. And so they were going to be involved. So they were looking for a place to be involved. And I said, "Hey, we've got this mission church in Chicago," and they loved that idea.
Yeah. Well, it's so good on so many levels because Pensacola and Chicago are very different, but they did well in both areas. And I'm sure having the community being part of the such a hospitable church helped in that in great ways. So thank you all for taking the time to share with us. And thank you to Andy and Robin for sharing, letting us share their story a bit and giving us some more information, maybe insight after all these years that has really helped us and I think can help other churches to make this handoff as they go along the way. We
We
want to
really
also,
are, to use your cliche or your
yeah,
tag, even thousands of miles away from each other, we really
yeah,
better together.
absolutely. Absolutely. And we thank you all who've joined us today. Hopefully, you can take this podcast, use it. Think about the people in your church that may be contemplating moving. Think about people in your area that are moving to your neighborhood and how you might be able to take on some of the actions that they did in Chicago. Truly, when we work together as churches, as pastors, as leaders, we truly do make a lot of progress. Every little thing we do matters. We're better together. Thank you for joining us today.